You're on to now, Plandáil.
Wajan Goni is Sauru Shejeg Shaskazada, Huel Minister Anglicanach as Jach Pobble Gonda Yentrama. Vishalave and Age and Urmi William Cumming as Kilrachdish, Dinna the Shaskaz Hian Minister Presbyteriach and Nolu, a her Aspwig na Hacha Amach as Habarasji. Hog Kerp and Da Hira a vi Crochtas in English, blast in Alsha a Coru Riven Minister Nua Anglicanach. Nilacho Pobble Cumming lena Aspwig, na lena Lior Ernie. Orlach ni Yelhid Da. Bhí William Cumming agus a phobal ag Galrachtais na Plandáil Albanacha is Jenny a Gogi Olu. Fanam seo hannig gach lún de Lonahori Albanacha Fried Vlente Jaccara Plandáil an Rishimus, iri amach sé jeg daihe te hien agus congus chrommel Erin, hí na dini seo le fanacht. Nor a hannig Jeru le Ream chrommel, hí Presbyteri Olu agus na Halaban a wach le Sherlas a da a chorarash a Gorain Hasana. In ye an umlein via hele a gonru agus Cunan Solanta. Bevian lima winter Presbyterach hien dala a gorsan Albanach go meo Sherlish in a ri an cheer a Christ in a ri an English.
It was said of Charles II that he took the covenants, though in his heart he hated them. So there's never really any question that these were things that he believed in. They were an expedient to try and win over support in Scotland. Charles doesn't want to be King of Scotland. Charles wants to be king of all his kingdoms. But Scotland, he reckons, is the best route to that victory. So if the price to be paid in 1651 is taking the covenants, he's prepared to do it. It's never something that he wants to see implemented.
Thigu a Shino an Chunanj Hollanda goro Sherlas ag taco leis Niglish Presbytera a Gynne Chocht na Nyaspag. Is an Shaw a Westminster blian a Nyeda Filu a Rinu Sherlas a Choranu in a Ri Hasana. Ach an Anyoin an Chunanj vi na Haspwig Lahar. Shaw mar a Skirio and Giolani Samuel Pepys. The crown being put upon Charles' head, a great shout begun, and he came forth to the throne, and there passed more ceremonies, as taking the oath and having things read to him by the bishop. And his lords, who put on their caps as soon as the king put on his crown, and bishops come and kneeled before him. Be Ian Parliament a Hinchi gur Aspwig agus han ministry Presbyteriacha a bheil lahar ag an Choranu. In ye vleint a chrommel, be vian lehi and cheer ve furiel an ahor. Agus le ri arash a gorain, ved sin oili, a coru canyal filu herlish. Cos simply ni chlagad sé le Jehu English Hasana. Be Ian here drama wahi and tahru miona London na na Presbyterian Yarin, or Hannigan warcho joku should as Kugya Olu.
Hig Charles, Garosha Rash e Whitehall, the Hive Parliament Hassan, agus Marajer Shehan, Harrow, Fon Era EU, Gola Tashta La Reach. Hig She, Garwan, Ariak, le Parliament Hassan.
Castle Milchanach Vion, Castle Nachro Sua Lesh. Maar Plian Rivishaw, Lerian na Turishki o Chogail Generalte de Janri an Ermen Yerin, Crinu de Parliament na Herren, Jed Hera. Lerian shades na Lehant o Loha, Ardvas Stadis na Presbyterach, few on the Shan Naivja a Vioku. Niro Ian Auris ag an amshan ach gur a dra na Presbyterach a veo ba herlish nor a Yanhi Rida. Presbyterach as Walia Clia a vi in a heplignach an channel. Corha Eishin an tra a Vasdini Aracho and English Fratastonach and Yerin Sanam, Masu Gorlesh and Presbyterachus Arachadshi, and Shah an Ard English Hampel Christ, Hor and Chogail, Tusla Troscu Moor Fud Fad Natira, Len and Yilshach de Leru, Don Conra, August Cunan Solanta.
For those who are sitting in the convention in Dublin, they're very clear that they want a Protestant establishment. A lot of them would be fairly open as to quite exactly what form that will take. And once it becomes clear that the mood in London is very much towards a restoration of the pre-war system within the church, then you see a lot of opinions swinging in that direction.
With the restoration of the monarchy came the purging of the Church of Ireland of Presbyterian elements under John Bramall, who now became Archbishop of Armagh, and also under Jeremy Taylor, who was the Bishop of Down. Around 70 Presbyterian ministers were expelled from the Church of Ireland. So Presbyterianism becomes an underground or a clandestine movement.
Bhí dearcú na cógála impithe an achar bliana, agus ní beg an chimney a chur an tachaíocht a bhí a ailig na haspaig Patrick Adair, an taon Minister Presbytera as cóige olú a bhí a láthair.
When our grandees gained intelligence of the pulse of the court, they began to court the few old bishops that were in Ireland. They allowed them considerable salaries and began to give them their titles. All things then turned as the inclination of the king was observed to be. The convention sent commissioners to the king, desiring the restoring of former laws and church government and worship.
A crinniú specialta a bhhaile bheanach, thocraí a chomhministeirí go gcorthaid siad toscareacht an go Londain le cur a gimhniú don rí a dhealtanas maidir leis an chonradh agus cúnan sálanta. Le codú ó John Clotworthy úinear talamhas chun intrama bhuail na toscarí le cóirleoirí de chud an rí. Thug siad spléchu a chápéis a bhí leá agus bhil dóibh gan Ian Taggart don chonradh agus cúnan sálanta a agailón, mar a scríú Patrick Adair.
The honest brethren were thus put to great straits what to do, having instruction from their brethren to offer nothing else but that address, and from their friends, on the other hand, telling them that it would not be acceptable. Neither would the great persons procure them access to His Majesty, except that they alter some expressions in it.
Bhí is ag na daoine tábhacht tacha seo mar a thug Adair orthu go raibh sé bartaithe ag Charles Hanna féin English hasanna a chuideaspag agus a leor ornaí a bhhanú a siocar gur éilé a Parliament sé. Fiú sular bhúil Charles leis an toscareacht Presbyterach a Londain bhí John Bramall ceappa ige ina phríú aghaidh nua Éireann. Ba é Bramall agus é ina aspag ghuire a bhí ina chrán cosanta ag Wentworth a gcéasú na Presbyterach agus na Gaisleachach sna 1630. Íchin na sean bliana 1660 cheap rí Charles Sir Charles Coote an Tierna Brohal agus Sir Maurice Eustace in an ard sean sa léirí in Éireann. Agus rialtas a ráis a bheim ní ró de dhí orthú ach a bhhanú eaglis na Héireann. Ar an 7 fiche de bhí dheanar sa bhliain 1661 níl aon áras go raibh Coote, Brohal agus Eustace a láthair ar chisreachan gá ard aspag agus dé náspag an seo an ard eaglis Naomh Pádraic a mhaile clia. Trí lá ina dhé sin chuir siad cosc ar chruinnithe Papirí, Presbyteri, Neamhspleáchaí, Anabáistí agus daoine eile a bheith siad a bheith in bhainnaí. Siad Presbyteri chuige olús tuisce a bhí híos leis seo, nuair a ddíriú saidirí le cruinniú a bhí acu ar a bhhaile manach a scapú. Mar a tharla, bhí an cruinniú thart fanáma danig na saidirí.
It's very clear by the 50s that those Presbyterian ministers who are cooperating closely are in Scottish communities. Their goal is never to be just a church for the Scottish people in Ireland, but largely in the 50s that's what they become. And at the same time as the state becomes suspicious of Scottish people and tries to keep Scottish people out of particular towns and keep Presbyterian ministers out of particular towns, so it's reinforcing a sense of solidarity among the Scottish communities, and it's reinforcing the connection between Presbyterianism and Scottishness in Ulster.
Níl aon áras mar sin faoin seaasú a bhí ag Presbyteri olú. Dark rialtas bhaile clia orthú mar dhíomhartaí agus mar ghaoine a bhris an dlí agus bheadh orthú ghlachu leis na hiarmhartaí. Ba trom gáasta a héagóás, Favaltaine séédeag seasca híon bhí gachtaine de réir an dlí glacú le heaglis na héireann. Chur aspa an dúin agus chonara Jeremy Taylor fis Sir Achan Minister Presbyteriach na Iosha go hardaglis lis na Gearawach. An lá river thug trúr ministry cuairteir ina Homrí an seo a Gaislan Winter Hill in Hillsborough le fáil amach go ddíreach a bhí a géisteige. Dúgur siad gur a bhíad géil síní chearta an riad ach nach méid siad híon agus a go ministry a láthair a lis na Gearawach an lá dar gionn. Híl siad gur a bé an cúspór a bhí le garam a neaspig Taylor ná le an nachad siad ar fad le réal na neaspig ar chórsaí eaglasta. Níor a bhada gur chur Taylor séisir ministry presbyteriacha is trocha amach as a gud eaglaisí agus fi dhearú na bliana hála an rud céarna de 8 is fich eile. An bhliain dar gionn curú James Cumming amach as eaglaisí gealreachtais agus ar náide ní sásta na leathasta a bhí sé héan ná a phobal. Dan na ministry briste seo ag buint fuhu sna sean farastí a bhíú acu. Gui William Cumming le fermaracht, congaracht deglis gealreachtais ach lean éireag búló lena phobal in na gud tíche agus chinne a gairú leo an rúpi bagga is sciobal agus a gilse skitse. Rinne é seo an chudjas mó fa chosins an darachadis, a dréibse nar a gáid sé cópanna an chonra agus cúnán solanta go pibli ar fod na héireann. Bhí ólach eile ar Presbyteri chuige olú. Anis bhí deachanna le hiac le heaglis na héireann chomáid le na ministrí hían a chathú. Ministeri a chathaí áras seasta a másc na neaspig mar a léirí an teaspig Taylor. Lord Jeremy Taylor le Ormond mar aspug. As long as those ministers are permitted amongst us, there shall be a perpetual seminary of schism and discontent. Na ministry presbyteriacha a hit ólach na gearlanana a gcónaí. Ach hannig fiawas an scíal le bás na haspig Bramall agus Taylor a bhisceacht ceara bliana de chéile, agus fi dhearú na séideag seascaidí thosaí siad héan agus a bobbal a thógáil eaglaisí de gud héan a bhád ar thiúil ón na bhailte móra.
There's an awareness across the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s that you're creating trouble for yourself if you clamp down too hard. So there are many years in which you get complaints going from people on the ground saying these Presbyterians are meeting openly, they're building meeting houses, they're operating even at a regional level. Something should be done about this. The state's reluctant to do too much because it doesn't want the trouble that might ensue.
In Year 4, séideag seachtú a dá, chur Sir Arthur Forbes a nniuil de Ministry Presbyteriacha gur bhíonn leis an rí tuairteas riaga nó Regium Donum de 600 punt a thuirt an Eaglis Presbyteriacha Ngearán le caiithú mar a ba bhíonn leofa.
Well, the Regium Donum came about because of a man called Forbes, who was a commander of the Irish Army, a Scotsman, who understood the Presbyterian psyche. My theory is that he saw the lie of the land in Ireland and he understood the Presbyterians are here to stay, the Church of Ireland are here to stay, we need some sort of accommodation. If we can tie them into loyalty to the government and the civil setup, all to the good. And so the first Regium Donum payment of £600 is going to pay something like a quarter of the stipend of Presbyterian ministers. And the theory behind that system is that if you're paying a quarter of their stipend, they're unlikely to preach sedition or rebellion.
A góitú ag an rí mar gheall ar a níolseacht, a géasú ag na haspig mar gheall ar a neasúlaíocht, ba aisteach an rocht in a ró Presbyteri olú gan áras. Chomá leis an bhliain séideag 8 a híon, fiche blian a néad a hairlas a dá gola góachta rís, char cuairt Presbyteriach an lágain lá ornithe agus trascaí ar son na heaglaise sa bhratan agus an Ngearán. Mar gheall ar an troscú, jaar údaris eaglis na héireann fínail scór punt ar Ministry Presbyteriacha ar an lágan. Agus nuair a dúiltaí ceathra rocu í a éag curú braidianas bála orthú ar fá bliana. Ní iontas ar bí gur Anglicanaí is mó a bhí ar an guiste cuairte. Go gcuirid in dhééis an trídú tíche tionáil na Presbyteriach agus curú dearú le hairú pibli. leaba a bháis dá sa bhliain 1685 hontaí Searlas a dá na Chaitlicach. Ní raibh cuma ar a scíal go mbeadh biseach ar chorsaí leis an neara hanig in dhé, Seamus a dá. Chaitlicacha a bhí an na háas an fód in líthe frí Chaitlicacha a thugann Parliament isteach. Tá sí an tuige mar sin go raibh scilt a Parliament Protestantach fa cho Arabas Hamish.
Go dtí bás Charles adó de bhí go leor iarachtaí ar siúl í lucht na Parliament sé Sasanna chun stoppa cuire i gcuine Seamus bheith mar éire de Charles adó tuisgur Catholic ach nuair a fuair an rí bás ní rá aon dul astó ach leacu le Seamus ach ní féidir rá go raibh siad lán sásta leis mar rí tuisgur rí Catholic ach ag an puinte sin ní rá aon éire aige agus de bhí siad sásta chursús leis cé có fada nach méoch lína Catholic ag teacht bheithí goráin.
Go lua ina rémas bégan don rí úr ja éirí amach a churfa chus, ceann an Alban agus ceann eile a Sasanna. Mar harúir sin, chuir sé lena aram. Nuair a thosaí Seamus a cheapú Caitlicach an ardifig san aram, rinn an Parliament gearan agus margheallar seo dridiú agus níor tháinig sé le chéile rís ar fáin chodéile de ré Hamish a dá.
Tiontaí Seamus leis an cheatlathe sa 1669 agus híl sé go raibh sé héin agus na Stuartaí I bhíthe leis na Catholic a chreid agus a fuair buas ar son a áthirsa agus a dheartharsa I gogu na trí réachta. So bhí Seamus a géirí na Catholic a chosint agus féocha na Stuarta a díl acu.
Bhí Richard Talbot éarla hir chanal agus fear ina ginrí Seamus an Éireann a tuairt ardú céime de Chaitlicí sa réaltas agus an aram chomáid.
Tá tuairimí na Protestanta as na Catholica for Richard Talbot le bhláisiú ina chuid las anamnethe. Cur na Catholicí fighting Dick Talbot cur na Protestúni lying Dick Talbot So haró mass ar bí ag na Protestúni híl siad go raibh sésin hanamhain go raibh sé géirí an aram a léanú le Catholicí ach go raibh siad ag géirí jeú a chur leis an active settlement ar sciobú an talún na Lego na Catholicí tar éis Concus Cromwell a gol siar go dtí Plandáil.
A go geolú agus an Éireann ar fad ceapú Shariami nua Caitlicacha a ngá contaí a chaháin an nuna náil agus tugu tromlach de Caitlicí ngách mór charparáid seachas a mell firste mar a ró scilt céige
Protestants moved fairly rapidly to create their own unofficial armed associations. And this is happening in Ulster long before James is being actively opposed as king. So these organisations are coming into being supposedly still loyal to the king, but for protective purposes. And what you begin to see, not on the same scale as 1641, but you begin to see some evidence of that same incidents of violence on the ground.
Trí bliana a néad de Himas teach de Garain, hanig a gréach an rud a bhó áhar imníd an Parliament Protestantach nar a Célia ó Mac, James Francis Edward Stuart, de Van Mary Modena. Seo an labba a chortús le Revloid, bas a leaba seo a rug Mary Modena James Francis, agus ó an am sin a ré chorú cá a gnuins rí Himas. Rive seo chhlaachtaí leis go néistar fí an ríchleocht go hinion Protestantach Himas Mary, ban chéile frinsa na híisiil tíre léamhariste. Bhí chumar a scíalanis go mé ríchleocht Caitlicacham.
James II, it's the birth of a son and an heir and a Catholic succession that sealed his fate, and the Protestant side is looking at Catholicism with suspicion. Gunpowder plot and all of that is now in the psyche. And to have a Catholic succession, a Catholic monarchy, and all the European dimension comes in there with Spain and France and all of that. Well, no, we want our Protestant Reformation values, if you like. That was the point of no return, I think.
Bhí an dú airg ar a Parliament agus ar uais le hasanna gur Célia ó éire Caitlicach don rí. agus in nédá reisimentí caitlicacha hortanalas éan is a whac clownish Liam Ariste a hui siad a shriel, a géri onrú a dhéanú, agus a guacht, a gréidú Protestanach agus a géim sa sel a gangniú. Nor a hannig an Prince Ariste a dír a sasana a mí hauna na bliana 68 was a hacht, ba léir gan dal gur onrú olwar ollanach a bhíon. As go bra le simas a dá, ar cosa a náirde hon na Francia a mí na nolig. Agus da Liam agus da van Protestúnach Mary a níon ba hinne ag simas a tugu an chorain.
Cred session go mé an Europe níos sacrathe san ad terma mar gheall an sacra seo. Tá ná a lethir afach ba an wagart ba wó a bhí rih an chogholiach nua hasanacht ísil tíirech na an rí díbartha simas a dá.
Chai simas trí bhíag Plandáil ansathe éan agus a rí an ama sin chur a inid tíirna hir chanil, aram de scór míle le chéile. Bhí súil ige an huaí den tíir agus gire ach go hairithe. Ba mhór an eagle a bhí Protestúnaí an tuaisceart rih éirí amach nua caitlicach. Agus níor chuidí litir gan aim a seálathaigh úsal Protestúnach an tíirna Mount Alexander, a dús bhí na nolig 68
Good my lord, I have written to let you know that all our Irishmen through Ireland is sworn that on the 9th day of this month they are to fall on, to kill and murder man, wife and child. And I desire your lordship to take care of yourself, for whosoever of them can kill any of you, they are to have a captain's place.
Fear no bregi mar litir, dírí lehi a grá a dhéanú.
Hannig scéal gire, an le a chonachas an litir sa chaithir, bhí garastún caitlicach a bhealach le chaid an garastún a bhí sa cheanasíocht an Protestúnaí an tíir na Mountjoy a ghlacu.
Bhí eagle a gragan witir gire. An ró garastún caitlicach le intrama a teacht le na gurtham bháis.
Dear Minister Presbyteriach Aidhúil dar a bhainm an Turamach James Gordon, dear sé ghine geataí na cachrach a ridjum, a chuí aspag gire de chudeglis na Heran Ezekiel Hopkins agus a ministry in A. Gordon.
Sa chir thuhal a lean, chlach scafte a tugu na apprentice boys ó hin, chlach sé darthu hen geataí na cachrach a ridj a ginne garastún le intrama a bhí le Aich Mountjoy chlacu. Híl Talbot gur iri amach a ginne rí simas a bhí a gceist, agus cheol sé Mountjoy a ráis le smacht a ghlachu gire. Bhíní an garastún gur gríú cosanta agus ná gríú mí dílseachta a ginne simas a bhíon.
Chlach Mountjoy leis, agus chur ina lí na Serenní ligan de ga reisimeint Protestúnaí don chuide mó, reisimeint fe cheanasíocht an Charneal Robert Lundy agus an Captain William Stewart fannacht sa gahar mar garastún. Hui an ga reisimeint seo le sé reisimeint a thug na Serenní iad hain.
Thívistí de chopla mí hí dearcú eile ag Protestúnaí olú hémas a dá. Bhí fuaitis Anglicannaí agus Presbyterií gur ó buint ige le huisce faoi hallú níos leithne in néadan na Protestúnach. Díbriú caitlicí as na bailte garastún deire agus inis ceathlan. Bhí eagla Protestúnaí olú go neanthaí eile orthú mar a rinneú le linn irí amach 16
Na roin sé ciomtáilíon na Heran amach a míhharrta 16 ba é an príomh chospóir a bhí ag simas a dá na cúige olú agus na dagan an na chlí sin inis ceathlan agus deire. Bhí díl seachtaí a gúige olú inis leis an rí Liam a trí.
The established church and the Presbyterians, there is still an element of a common Protestantism, particularly when it's placed under threat. And they do see James as that kind of threat. They see James as someone who has departed from the way a king should be. So rather than rebelling against a king, it's the king who's departed from the way he should have acted to be a proper king.
The clí rialtas na Héireann dílis de seamas a dó, agus go hifigiúil je aram an stáit de bhí sé fáil de Seamus Adó. Agus tháinig Protestúnig chuig alle de heisiad ina cuineb ní rá siad sásta bheith dílis de Seamus Adó as an puinte sin a raig. Tuis go rá límaráiste agus bhain céile tací go róin í sasanna. Agus de heisiad ina cuineb insna dúnta cosanta í goig go alle ach go mór í nera féin.
Chur éirle hir chanal aram ó hui han arthar an chuige a chur fan na smacht. Is an sin hoisi Protestúni a hehu go henis cealan agus deire, agus níor a bhada go raibh an chathair plódaithe de cailíní a géirí díjan. Bhí governor míleta na Cachrach, Robert Lundy, cinse dearafata go mrisí an chathair gan áras. Héis sé agus dag muintir na Cachrach an muí na cinúna. Béad an turamach George Walker agus an muir Henry Baker a ghlach a aid. Bhí an chathair níos an muí na seach a bíteach tí an muí den na bhálaí. Ar an 8ú le déag dabrann 6-8 hanig rí Seamus a bharcaíach tá gead an neaspaig agus dír ar an chathair Gelston de aram. Haring sé siar áfach nar a scílú leis.
Gentlemen, have a care! Prepare to get fire! Get fire!
Níor luiche an tilléir moscaid sin scíilte go raibh tús cortha le léagar gheire. Tiracha míle Protestúnach in nire a has idir aram an rí agus bua an oltamh. Creidtar gur Presbyteri ceathar déag is gach cúigar déag don na cosantóirí tíomhastí den na bhálaí. Wair léagar gheire breis agus céad lá agus cailú láchod den na daoine tíomhastí do bhála na Cachrach. Hanig dearú leis nuair a bhris long fuiisih an Mountjoy an tailmhara ar an neamhail a bhí sa bhealach ar aon loch tarthala. Agus gair bhálta a ligan ag na daoine rinn an long a ballach a níos an fiabhal a tar a heilehoirt ar a phobal bristú brúite. Agus aram na seach a bíteach ag tehol leis a dheas, níla sogam a ruas ag pobal na Cachrach a háhachtaí is a bhí an rua. Bíad na Protestúní go chlánacha tíomhastí do bhálaí gheire a ghlán an ballach do bhua líam an nearan. La ní beidir non. In Yea and Yeager, Dilshi and Turamach George Walker a true account of the siege of Londonderry. We sé on gur a bheith hían agus bhfuil deglis na heran a wine a hawal an chair. Ba an tían wallo a dag sé na ministry Presbyteriacha nar chivan leis an naniam nacha Maria gur they kept their people very obedient and quiet. His léir gur Walker a géirí a jaachlú héan agus deachlú a eglis a héan a bhuanú dag ban na Presbyteri a bhí tíomhastí den na bhálaí.
It says everything about relations at the time that the one church, St. Colum's, was used for 2 services and neither the twain could meet. You know, the Anglicans worshipped in the morning according to their fashion and the Presbyterians in the afternoon. That speaks volumes of relations, even in a time of siege when life is on the line. They couldn't work together and they couldn't accommodate each other in that way.
Presbyterians were very proud of the role they played in the Siege of Derry, and contemporary sources tell us that they made up the majority of those who were within the walls. The problem was that a difference of opinion developed amongst Anglicans and Presbyterians about who were the true heroes of the Siege of Derry. You had George Walker on the one hand, who went on a propaganda campaign fairly soon after the siege, saying that he was the guy that saved Derry from the Jacobite forces. Presbyterians, particularly John Mackenzie and other people, said that no, it was Presbyterians that had saved Derry, and for them the hero was Adam Murray rather than George Walker.
Bhí taithí fearsanta ag an uramach John Mackenzie ar an léagar or bhí sé ina bhinisteir do thion de reisimentí na Cachrach. Sa leor leis narrative of the Siege of Londonderry has sé suas don na Presbyteri tíomhastí den na bhálaí. Agus sular iltí sé é, dír sé é rinch daoine agus saidirí mór le rá a bhí tíomhastí den na bhálaí ag an nám minscrúdú a dhéanamh air. Agus bhí sé de lig déan ghú maidir leis an nnéar an bhí an agus an ráil bag a Jimmer Walker. Tamil gerid in é bhrisú légar gaire Hastal Walker gur London áitir chur rí Liam fáilte mhóribh mar governor gaire ag Sharman is mór. Gó teach na deachtaí buchas leis agus tugu Jontas £5,000. Ag tús an true account leis sé a thugan Walker hían, Your Majesty's most obliged, most faithful, most obedient subject and servant. An you hugga sin a raf o will ella da English, the aspwig hasanacha on the vi mihesta, leis an ri nua Liam agus a wanrian Mary. Agus cúgja olu anish fwy smacht, hanig ri Liam a jeer an sahern, and carhu la jeg the vi vehev, she jeg noha.
Deirtar gonyachi an ri Liam a jeer on a wad Mary an ait shaw, agus gonyachi she go garagaragish win capel. Chai sé níos lú na uachligan seo agus a rá leis an sin go bell ferste.
An luúan bhfuil sé le toscaracht aglista fa stúr an urimi George Walker. Lean grúpa Presbyteriach rud a chur farrig Walker.
The injustices of the past are burning away, and they want to impress upon the king their loyalty and the force for good and their numbers in the community, and you know they are a key clientele, and William responded to that.
Kerala in Iation and Shaw ag Hillsborough, hug Liam Udras ganyek fi for Yontas Rega, the Villa Rachid pont leis an English Presbyteriach, a Villa Hake one blain tool. Lerian and Tor the Rega, Hugan Tudras Shaw, Ahru Folye, so Jarko a Presbyteri Olu.
Ní áwer inti sé go dearn an Turamach George Walker, Garan Publi van Vruntan Shaw, the Ministry na Halabun. Ní ro an Chanswaid Fuina, true account of the siege of Londonderry ag trag a fáil ach bhí jeru toban tí teach der sin bhruachan na baine. Is an wáirt an chéad lá Júil sé déag nócha bhruachan na baine a treidiú an ca ciniúnach sin a thug an lá an nuachtar de Liam Éireann.
Go luath maidian has 36,000 trúpa de chláán Wally and Shaw an Theo Hui den Owen, and a fihis a Cahar Mila, Shaka Beachach, fa Canasiacht, and Re Hemish an Theo Ella. Ga Ur Jeg, Nieshan, August Mila, Kuig Head Far, and a Lee Maro an Leher Haha, Vian La Haram, and Re Liam.
Den Lechra a Vier Lar, Vian Turamach, George Walker, Bala Hurriker Muska Jil Yogaway, and ye the Hemis a Daw, an bua a chailog in wán, hé sé an lethar chatha, a harann sé an rank mar ar chonaí sé ar dúireacht an chodéile dá héal. Jill Liam ar hasanna ach dána aram an yeran go dtí breisiú achrama, ba é síniú chonrú limní a chur dearú le cogaíocht an yearú fór sé déag nótha hían.
Our intish a ví sa méid trácra a léirí ó sa chonra de chaitlaí na Héireann, ach nar a hanig Parliament na Héireann le chéile rís an mhaile clia, dúiltí sí bhéanta an rí a dheanganú agus reachtaí sí rint tlíthe frí chaitlachacha.
Ba é an tréimhse a bidde gan cágu an oltamh an tréimhse a lean conrú limní.
Hanig na mílte lonathór albanach le gol leo siúd a dil in é légar gara. Ba é an cías ísel agus an dhearchéim a gursaí tauliaachta sa bhaile a bhail na lonnaíthóra nua albanacha seo go cúige olu.
Well, the most significant migration was the 1690s. This was the last time in Scottish history that people in the Lowlands starved to death. People who migrated from Scotland to the north of Ireland in the 1690s were actually famine victims. And, you know, given the politics of Ireland and the Irish famine, you know, there's no supremacy over people in the sense that a famine victim is a famine victim. So perhaps as opposed to a migrant from Scotland to Ulster being a sturdy, hard-working Ulster Scot, in fact many of them were people who were in a pretty perilous position.
Master go ridir céige agus 8,000 duine nua hanagus deach. An áitina an arthar olú is fis go raibh fórmhar na níní ina Presbytery, rud a chur isteach ar an chléir áitiúil de chuid Eaglis na hÉireann. Ar fud chuige olú is go hoscailte a chhlacht Presbytery a gréidú, le sionnad agus le session cearcocu. De réir an dlí bhí a muintear deachúna a go fáil le Eaglis na hÉireann ach a léad fuair a ministrí écaíocht bhliantúil ón choráin Sasanna. Ba an chúis ba bhó garain a bhí ag an Eaglis Presbyteirach ag an am ná nar aitheann an stát pású ar bí de chuid.
Probably the thing that bothers them most is that their marriages are not accepted as valid, where Catholic marriages are. But marriages conducted by a Presbyterian minister are not valid, and that has all sorts of implications for the legitimacy of children, for the inheritance of property. So it's those kind of practical problems. We're not talking about large-scale repression, but things that affect people's everyday life, that creates frustration and tension, even in the 90s.
Reachtaí Parliament na hÉireann anis a bhí a réalú ag sco aicme de chuid Eaglis na hÉireann. Reachtaí sí dlí uair sa bhliain 73 a churthú srían ar as breise na pápachta.
Presbyterians found themselves in a situation in Ireland where a confessional state had been set up, where your access to political power and social power was based on the religion that you confessed, in other words, being a member of the established Church of Ireland. And what happened was that those who weren't members of the established Church of Ireland, the Catholic majority and also the Presbyterian community in the north of Ireland, were excluded by penal laws from access to full political and social power. And the best example of that was the so-called sacramental test that was tacked on to the 1704 Popery Act. And Presbyterians took grave offence to this because they said, here we are defending the Protestant constitution at the Siege of Derry, and in 1704 we're being treated the exact same as the Catholics that we were fighting against. So Presbyterians found themselves in a second class, if not third class status by the early 18th century.
Seamuid mar sin céad bliain níos faide a ré ó Plandáil Freebudeach Montgomery agus Stuart agus Plandáil fa a réacht bhí simas leis an Eaglis Presbyteirach bunaithe a goige olú agus go fáil bog arcan aspoig Anglicanach na hÉireann orthu mar aachma agus bagart a buint lá. Ar bhealach pogu ar winter ma hinhan wahara a bheith scitse amach mar ghini. Bhí an tír a reachtail ag drám bog dúis le Protestanacha a chynne amach as ifigí pibli as an aram agus as an Parliament siad. Hig siad go ríhaid de mé ó bagart an ó Chatlicí go seaún na lonathirí Albanacha seo leá. Fuair siad crothú ar sin in ionsaí chéire. Sacrú neoráite a bhí gceist an seo a bhair ar fa céad bliain. Bhí his tilteanach chur suas le Presbyteriála ach ní chhlaci leo agus is cinse nach gorthaí muinneáin